Alright, ever since learning about the Acolyte of Chayula, I figured I would want to try Chaos Monk, and since there's relatively few of those skills in the game, I settled for Hexblast. And the build turns out to be pretty amazing once you get to the end game, as you'll blast through maps while one-shotting packs of enemies and poisoning everything around you. This does come with a caveat though, and that's bad boss damage. Now, instead of going every single node on the passive tree, I'm gonna give you the blueprints to make your very own version so that you're not necessarily reliant on the pieces of gear that I currently have. I will of course add a link with my current build to the pinned comment, and you can always come check me out on Twitch if you want to see the build in action. As it stands, I have now cleared up to tier 11 maps, and anything below 10 isn't posing that many risks anymore. Anything above 10, I have to make sure I don't get CC'd, as the damage might get to me before I can control my character again. But those issues will be solved in due time as I level up further and I get a couple of extra nodes and have more than 3 links on my skills. Because yes, I only committed to this build 2 days ago, so there's still a lot of room for improvement. So let's get to it and start with the skills. Your main focus will be souping up Hexblast so that it deals as much damage as possible, which you can do in 3 different ways. The most obvious are the support gems, where I've opted for cast speed, extra damage and an extra level to the ability itself, which is actually the next way we're gonna further buff our damage. The easiest way to do this is by getting dark entries on the passive tree, which is all the way to the right, but happens to be on a rather favorable path with other nodes that will eventually want to pick up anyway. To then add even more levels, we're gonna be investing in some gear, notably in a wand and focus. Right now I have a wand with +4 levels to all chaos skills and a focus with another +2 to any spell, which combined with my actual gem puts Hexblast at level 24. And just to show you how much of a difference these levels can make, you'll notice that without the wand and focus equipped, the spell only will deal 3.8k damage. When I equip both, we end up just shy of 10k. The downside of this high of a skill level is gonna be the mana cost, so if you happen to be struggling at any point, you might want to downgrade the level until you can sustain casting a couple of times in a row. With my current gear setup, which is far from optimal by the way, I'm using about a third of my mana, but that doesn't really matter unless I'm fighting bosses, at which point I will need to chug flasks and run over the occasional flame of Chayula. Now, Hexblast needs a curse it can detonate, which is why we're gonna bring Blasphemy, which reserves 60 spirits per curse and applies them to enemies all around you. This does mean that we can't invest in any of the darkness passes with this build though, as those will remove all spirit and would force us to cast a spell manually, which will practically ruin the way the build plays. As for the slotted in curse, the most obvious choice would be to use Despair, so that we deal even more chaos damage by lowering our enemies' resistance. But I've been experimenting with temporal chains instead, which slows down enemies and makes effects expire more slowly. And this added layer of defense has actually been such an incredible quality of life, I'm reluctant to give it up, especially since we're one-shotting most enemies anyway. Next we have Contagion, which is actually another excellent defensive ability since the chaotic freeze support gem inflicts freeze on our target. And if you then cast 1 or 2 Hexblasts, they'll be frozen. You'll even freeze most rares with this in a couple of casts. This does come with yet another caveat though, and that is that shattered enemies don't leave a corpse behind, which we're gonna want for Decompose, which is an ability we get from our unique boots. Simply put, any corpse you run over will be consumed and turned into a poison cloud. I further put in support gems that increase the poison's effect and a 25% chance to not consume the corpse. These boots are so powerful by the way, that as soon as you kill your first few enemies, the poison actually does the rest for you. It's even gonna take care of rare and magic monsters, and makes bosses with adds a whole lot more manageable. These 3 are the base components, but since we still have a good amount of slots left over, I chose to pick up Essence Drain to help deal with bosses faster, and Dark Effigy, which I mainly use for the Font of Mana support gem, which increases my mana regen as long as the totem is up, which means more spell casting on bosses. Lastly, I'm bringing Grim Feast, which spawns orbs from any fallen enemy that will replenish your energy shield. And since I'm currently relying on Chaos Inoculation, these are basically infinite heals as long as there are enemies around. Now, if you haven't played the Acolyte yet, you might not know this, but you can also socket in support gems into the Preach. And even if those have a spirit cost, they'll still work without actually reserving whatever amount they require. I've already mentioned the boots, as well as wanting to prioritize extra levels on your wand and focus. And before you try and get one from the trading website or farm for one, make sure the wand also has modifiers to spell and chaos damage and the focus to mana and energy shield. The rest of your gear will follow the same philosophy. You'll want to invest into energy shield, resistances, and then any way to further boost your damage, be it directly or through more mana. The one other unique I've invested in are the Ghost Wraith Tattered Ropes, which actually single-handedly boost my energy shield from around 2k to nearly 5k. So if you're gonna be following my build to a T, I definitely recommend prioritizing those. There is also a flask I would love to try out, which deals damage based on the mana you've spent to everything around you and replenishes your mana when used, with the downside of it inflicting chaos damage on you. Now, since I'm using Chaos Inoculation, this would essentially be a free damage boost. But I need about 50 Divine Orbs or a couple of thousand Exalteds if I ever plan on buying one for myself. Now, all of this gear was either found or bought for 1 Exalted each, which means that it's far from optimal. I don't have any of my resistances capped out, and I could definitely do with some extra mana and spell damage, but so far that hasn't slowed down any of my progress. I'd also like to warn you against using the unique Demon Stitcher Gloves, which replenish energy shields based on your life sacrificed. I've made the mistake of thinking that since I have 1 HP from Chaos Inoculation, I wouldn't be punished for using them, until I realized that 10% of 1 HP doesn't actually keep my shield up. Okay, so that's skills and gear out of the way, so let's tackle the passive tree next. Now, I am very new to the game, to the franchise even, so there's probably stuff that we can still optimize, but when picking which nodes to go for, I have a couple of targets. The first is of course increasing my chaos damage, the second is energy shield, and then the third is anything else that makes me survive longer, like having a higher stun threshold or a freeze threshold. Of all of the chaos damage nodes, the only cluster I didn't go for is the one with Event Horizon, which would boost my damage by a whopping 82% if I only picked the big nodes, and that's not even accounting for the other 5 smaller ones that give another 35% in total. The reason being that it's gonna cost you 3% of energy shield every time you cast. And while we can get by with casting relatively few spells when fighting regular enemies, as our boots do most of the work anyway, we would suffer greatly on boss fights, and it hampers energy shield regen as you're essentially taking damage which would interrupt it. I've also been thinking of eventually adding Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery to the mix, which would convert all of my energy shield to mana and then have that function as my second health bar. But it's quite far out of the way, and I have points I want to spend elsewhere first. You sadly also can't invest into that node with the emotions you get from deliriums, so that's gonna be off the table too. I have mentioned I'm using Chaos Inoculation a couple of times already, and that's because it's currently helping me deal with chaos damage I'm taking, as my gear is far from optimal. Doing so does make my Flames of Chayula weaker though, as every red flame is now essentially wasted since I can't use those to heal, which brings me to the downsides of playing a Hexblast monk. The Flames of Chayula are great, especially since they boost our damage considerably and they help us regen mana, which comes in handy in protracted fights. But if you commit to Chaos Inoculation, you're somewhat nerfing the ability. I've also already mentioned that darkness is off the table, since we don't want to give up our spirit for blasphemy, and since I'm using Chaos Inoculation, Chayula's gift is essentially yet another dead trait, as I don't really need the extra chaos resistance. So that leaves me with the Flames of Chayula, which I'm probably gonna stick to as long as I'm playing this build. We also have Reality Rending, which gives us a chance to add a considerable amount of chaos damage to our attacks. Now, since we're not actually attacking that often, this trait is a boost, but it doesn't help as much as if we were playing a quarterstaff or a bow. I will eventually try out the Mana Leech traits, which I'm well aware of don't really work without using a physical ability. But I do want to try out the final trait that stops our energy shield from recharging naturally and instead use Mana Leech to replenish the shield, and see how bad that's gonna be when I'm relying on using the flames, as well as Eternal Youth, which I'm already using, as it makes my health flasks heal my shield instead of my HP. It'll probably turn out to be pretty bad, but I'm willing to waste some gold in the name of science here. So what's next for this build? Well, I'll probably start with the obvious and invest in more energy shield and try to increase my freeze and stun thresholds through some of the passive nodes. Next is further improving damage, and probably trying out a few abilities like Toxic Growth by having a bow in my second set and see if those help me kill bosses faster. My ultimate goal is getting to Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery and Chaos Inoculation, but I think I need a good 30 more passive points before I even get those. I will be updating my build as I go though, so if anyone wants to follow along, make sure you keep an eye out on my channel, or just go watch me on Twitch and ask your questions there. I'm also working on a Pathfinder, which frankly makes better use of poisons, and a Demon Form Witch, which actually would make better use of Hexblast. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to play a Chaos Monk, or rather a Chunk.